Are you curious about Gestalt language processing? You are not alone. Join me, Corinne Smoose, and speech therapy PD for our podcast, The Gestalt Get Together. Our episodes try to balance the enthusiasm and excitement about GLP and its associated intervention ideas, as well as a healthy dose of skepticism about how to understand and integrate this paradigm shift into your career and the field at large. We hope that you can get together with us to learn more about Gestalts.
Welcome to SLP Learning Series, a podcast series presented by SpeechTherapyPD.com. The SLP Learning Series explores various topics of speech-language pathology. Each season dives deeper into a topic with a different host and guests who are leaders in the field. Some topics include stuttering, AAC, sports concussion, teletherapy, ethics, and more. Each episode has an accompanying audio course on SpeechTherapyPD.com and is available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. Now, come along with us as we look closer into the many topics of speech-language pathology.
As everyone's filing in, can everybody hear me now as I'm talking? Can our guests hear us? This is so exciting.
It really is a lot of fun.
Welcome, 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 everyone. We're going to get started soon. Welcome. See, I love that I should talk about where we are too.
We should talk about this amazing.
We're in a meat market.
I mean, we're in the middle of
literally, we're where the
downtown,
sausage is being made.
where the
Look,
sausage is
that
being
man
made.
has a sausage
He's
in his hand.
casing it. I think I saw earlier they were doing something with fish too, if I'm not
Oh yeah,
mistaken.
they throw fish all around here. That's the thing. Go ahead as you're filing in. You know, I always like to hear where people are coming from. So be sure to throw your location in the chat and let me know where you're from, because I want to see where everybody is coming in. The last couple ones, we had a lot of California. I see we have about 20 people in the room.
All right. Hello, everybody.
Let's see. Upstate New York. The only place colder than Chicago.
And maybe even Seattle right now.
Yes, upstate New York. I have a lot of respect for upstate New York. New Jersey, Wisconsin. I'm from Michigan, so I can do that. The Wisconsin.
Does that make it okay?
The nasal.
That makes it okay?
It's like a nasal familial bond that all Midwesterners share. It's not cold today? Oh, okay. Southern California. All right, Southern California. Go ahead and rub it in. What's your weather looking like? San Diego, another beautiful place. Long Island, woo! See, perfect Wisconsin accent.
You did?
Because I'm a
Someone said so?
Michigander. Yeah, Wisconsin.
All right. Well, if they're from there,
Yeah.
then they definitely
I
know.
got
And they
Midwest
have
street
approved.
cred. This is all a farce. This can get real nasally.
Oh my God.
If
Look,
it
I'm not
needs
trying.
to.
I'm not going to do that.
Boulder, Colorado, Compton. I love it. Another New Jersey. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Can I go? All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to our 7th and final episode of our podcast, Culturally Speeching. And I am your host. My name is Dr. Treasure Williams-Wood, and I will be your speech therapy PD moderator for this course. And before we start, as always, we're going to do some housekeeping. And I have a few items to alert you with. This course is going to be for 1 hour, and you will be able to get your ASHA CEUs. This is like a double entendre because you're getting ASHA CEUs while we're at ASHA during the ASHA conference. Okay. So again, like I said, this is kind of like a bittersweet moment, right? And we decided for the final episode in our 7-episode series of this podcast that we were going to come to you from Seattle at the ASHA Convention, and we wanted to incorporate our theme for the theme that the ASHA Convention has, which is Elevate. And who better to help us do that than my esteemed guest, Jerrold Jackson. And so I'm going to go ahead and give introduction for Jerrold. You already know me. I'm Dr. Treasure Williams-Wood. I do get financially compensated for my participation in this podcast. I also am the CEO and founder of Willwood Consulting Services and a salaried employee of Lingraphica. Jerrold is the CEO and founder of Roundtree Group and is also serving as this year's speech language pathology co-chair for the convention. So everything we see going around in Seattle, he had his hands in. What you may not know is that Jerrold is a lifelong advocate for culturally responsive practices with a range of professional experiences, including consulting. He was an assistive technologist. He has been a graduate program coordinator, and he received his bachelor's degree from, hold on, I got to make sure I say it right, Southern University, home of the dancing dolls, home of the human jukebox, home of the gumbo. No, I made that up. That's not a part of it. I just get carried away.
Though. That was good. That was good.
He went to Southern University and A&M College, a historically Black college and university. And he has a master's from my alma mater, Western Michigan University, both degrees in speech, language, and hearing sciences. Mr. Jackson is also presented nationally by invitation on topics related to supervision, culturally responsive practice, and he has served as an adjunct faculty member across not one, not two, but 3 different universities. He is also serving as an MBASLA board member. For those of you who don't know what MBASLA stands for the National Black Association of Speech, Language, and Hearing. And let's see, he was also named as the 40 under 40 Cohort 3, which recognizes graduates that made significant contributions to our profession. So please join me in welcoming our esteemed guest for our final podcast, where we are going to talk about how do we elevate our practice through cultural humility in our profession. Thank you so much for being here. Let me just give you I know I can touch. I know I can. Yeah, we're going to do church hug. I can touch my guests here, which is usually not something that I'm used to being able to do. So I really appreciate that. And I would just love to hear from you before we really get into it is, how are you feeling? How are you feeling in Seattle? Talk to me about the process of planning this convention and how it feels to be here now in the Emerald City after years.
This long journey.
Years of this work that you've been doing.
Oh my gosh. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I mean, I feel honored and privileged to be your final guest of what has been an amazing series. You brought so much energy, so much information, and so much, I think, something that's going to be a ripple impacting the field for a while with these conversations that you've had. So for me to be here with all of you is just really an honor. So thank you, and Speech Therapy PD, for inviting me here.
You are so welcome. Oh, and one more thing. We do have a little screen that we're going to be looking at. So when you see us looking around, you know we encourage participation. Oh, hi, Oklahoma. So if you have a question, please make sure you drop it in the chat for our guests, drop it in the chat for me. I'd like for this to be very informal. So same stuff.
So, I mean, to answer how I'm feeling, I was telling this earlier as we've been walking around and just seeing people and everyone saying hello, and it's like, oh, I'm so excited. Like, I really don't know if I have words to describe how I'm feeling other than just elated and just humbled. I don't know, just like the feeling, someone described it as like putting together magic. And I really do feel like it's been a magical experience for me, not just because I'm a co-chair, but because to see these things, this idea come to life, and then people responding to it, connecting, exceeding goals. 13,000 people.
13,000
at this convention.
That's really rare for a West Coast convention, right? Normally we expect 10,000, but 13,000 is really rare for a West Coast convention, and for you to accomplish that, especially post-pandemic.
Yes, so we're thrilled that it's like a synergy in the air. And so it really has fed my energy. So I'm just appreciative for everyone who's registered, people who've been here in person, who've been online. It's just been a really rewarding experience to see what you thought of as like this little nugget of an idea just come to fruition.
Love it. So one thing that I love is the theme of this convention, which is Elevate, right? And I remember speaking with you about it when you chose the theme, and one of the things that you talked about was, Elevate is like a call to action to just think creatively, to be innovative and to challenge ourselves. And so my first question for you is, how does cultural humility, right, help elevate excellence within our profession, within the field of communicative sciences and disorder? How do we use cultural humility as a tool to elevate?
And this is a lot that can go into that response. But really at the foundation of it, when we talk about cultural humility and what it means, and especially being in a health and human supports profession, if we're not thinking about what it means to officially, realistically, authentically connect with and offer respect to another individual, whether that's a colleague, a patient, a client, anyone else that we're working with on any of our teams, then what are we actually doing? So I think that understanding what it means to engage in cultural humility, or to practice it, or to live it, or to infuse it into everything that you do, if we're not doing that, how can we ever lift off the ground and accomplish what it is that we are saying that we're going to accomplish as these professionals who are focusing on communication?
So you just said two things that I want to kind of dissect a little bit, because they really resonated with me. The first thing you said was, you said using humility as a vehicle of respect, for respect. And I think that, especially in this day and age where, you know, we see that DEI programs are starting to be rolled back and DEI is being considered, you know, a new dirty word, looking at how something that is seen as humility is also seen as a tool for respect. And humility literally means to yield, right? To go low, right? To lower yourself and yield to another person's culture and perspective. But the theme is elevate. And so it's kind of like this inverse relationship. But I think in any kind of you know, school of thought with teaching, and if you're a person who meditates or you do yoga or any kind of spiritual practice, you'll notice that that's a common theme, right? Is that the more humble you get, the lower you get, right? The more you almost kind of die to your ego and die to yourself, right? And yield. The more you actually do ascend and elevate your mindset and your perspective. So I loved that. And another thing I loved was the challenge to infuse it into everything. And that's something that we've been talking a lot about on our show, is how really it's not a checkbox. It's not a 2 credit hour compromise that you just happen to do. It's truly figuring out, how can I put myself in a position where I'm always self-reflecting? And how can I show up in this way that feels good for my growth and development in every single thing I do? So I love that.
And you know, when you talk about the whole thing of like lowering yourself, when we're talking about elevating, it's not necessarily that you're putting yourself down, is not necessarily you're diminishing your existence for someone else's. It's really about a decentering of yourself in the moment to bring space for someone else who has whatever the communication concern is or whatever the issue is. We're in this space. I know who I am. I need to know who you are. We need to be able to connect. So it's not about that. And in this process to understand someone, you can step back and give them space to be who they are, recognize that there are differences, and say like, okay, we have differences. Let's learn about those differences. And how can I incorporate what it is that's important to you into what I'm doing to support you, and that we're collaborators at this point.
And you know what, I like that. I think I'm going to use that term more. And you know, we talk, because again, humble, we think meek, we think low, but really we can look at it more as decentering. I'm going to take myself out of the middle of someone's lived experience, and I'm going to take myself out of the middle of the circle and decenter myself.
Because the lived experience that we're focusing on is the individual who's come to us for our support, our expertise, but then we don't always reciprocate that and realize that the person who's coming to us has a level of expertise. And what is that expertise? It's them.
They are the experts on our families, are the experts on their loved ones. Exactly. And so as a follow-up question, so when we talk about equity, visibility, I'm really interested to hear your perspective on this. How does visibility contribute to this type of elevation, right? And I would love for you to share, you guys, you had some firsts this convention, specifically when planning the convention, who was invited to have seats at the table and who has been visible. How does visibility contribute to elevating cultural humility?
I think in so many ways, to be honest. We have a statement that, people use all the time, representation matters. And it does. Inclusion is essential, and equity is where we're trying to get to. So yes, when you're having someone represent themselves, they're bringing into this space just by showing up with whatever intersections and identities they have. They're already bringing in something different.
Yeah.
They're already bringing in a perspective that probably has not been heard or discussed before. And so right there, in the moment, we're transforming an atmosphere from what we typically understand. And I'm sure you all have talked about this before. We understand the demographics of our profession as a whole. So speech, language, and science, we know as a whole does not get the identity of being very inclusive or having various representation from what we know as a global society. So typically we find that our committees within our organization look a certain way. It's not typically one that allows for variation in representation, ideas, and thoughts. And so one of the things that my co-chair and I said from the beginning is that when we bring together the people who are going to plan the programming for a national convention, let me take that back, an international convention.
Yeah, because
we're worldwide.
Yeah, yeah.
And so how can we capture the perspectives of an international convention with a group of people that don't represent our global society?
Yeah.
At all levels. So age, race, ethnicity, practice setting, geographic location,
socioeconomic.
Yes, all of these things.
All of it.
And so how do we put together a conference or convention that's global in nature if we don't have representation of different views? And so that was one of the things that we felt that was paramount. And that took some courage, and it took some thinking differently. So we decided, let's figure out how can we put together a committee of people that represents those ideas.
Wow. And I want to thank you for so many things. My brain is just lighting up as you're saying some of these things. And one of the things you said is that it takes courage. And I think that in this season that we're in with trying to be intentional, I think we can't assume that we're just going to get it by osmosis. Yeah. Cultural humility is not something that you just get by osmosis, just by being, your proximity to a continuing ed or just being around a group of people. You have to be very intentional about putting yourself in situations that make you uncomfortable.
Yes.
Right? You have to be intentional about not necessarily being perfect when you raise your hand and say, hey, maybe somebody else would be better suited to have a seat at this table. Yes. And so what you said when you said you had to be brave, I think people don't realize is that those of us who, are talking about cultural humility and are always talking about equity and inclusion efforts, it is a daily reminder. Yes. I have to daily remind myself on a daily basis, okay, this is uncomfortable, but you're not in danger. Discomfort does not mean danger. You will be asked to do things when you're doing this work, when you are trying to be humble, when you're trying to reflect, that make you so incredibly uncomfortable in your practice and how you relate to your colleagues and how you really reflect. And that's okay. We have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Absolutely. And to kind of add to that, I think, we talk about the word elevating. And we talk about it from this excitement, this level. It's like we're going to new heights. But how many of us have a fear of heights?
That's a good point.
How many of us get nervous climbing a ladder, climbing high stairs, getting on a plane, getting in a hot air balloon, jumping out of, all these things that are saying that we're rising, we're ascending. Yeah. It's scary. It's fearful.
When you're actually doing it, you're
it can
thinking,
be scary to
I'm
float.
going to die.
It can be scary to go to that next level. All of that ignite some kind of fear.
That's true.
So it's going to be an uncomfortable, and everything about elevating isn't going to be a pleasant next step. It's going to be scary. It's going to be what's next. I have never been in this atmosphere before.
Yeah.
I've never been in this stratosphere before. What am I going to be able to breathe? Am I going to be able to survive? So elevating is a great idea, but to actually get to the top, to get to the summit, to get to the pinnacle, it's scary.
It's scary.
So you have to be willing to take a chance on that journey, and you can't just sit back and be comfortable about it.
I love it. I love it. And so tell me, Jerrold, so as a co-chair of the ASHA Convention, how have you seen progress in this area?
I would say the progress that I've seen relates to some people being really open to the idea of change. But I think where I have to give the credit to are the people who you go and tap and ask.
And they say yes.
And they say yes, and they have the courage to say yes.
Yes.
Even when they don't think that they're capable of doing it, or they've never thought about this before, or they've never imagined themselves in this space.
Yeah.
They had to step out on some level
Yeah.
to
Of
say,
risk.
okay, I'm doing this. But also, when we talk about cultural humility and building community and engaging, it also is about a relationship. And to build a relationship that is sustainable, there has to be a level of trust. So there has to be a situation where, you're asking me to do this.
Right.
I have to trust that you're going to bring me into a space where I can thrive.
A psychologically safe space.
And that it is safe,
Yeah.
and that we're actually going to be able to do the things that we do. And while we can't guarantee that to be perfect, there has to be a level of trust and respect to say, like, okay, you're doing this, you're asking me to do it, let's make this happen, and know that we're going to be in this thing together. So that's where I think the progress was made in developing and having people where you could develop these relationships and create an environment where people felt safe to do the things that they already know that we need to do, and then feeling empowered to then do that. So I see that as a way of progress. My concern, and I guess the follow-up to that would be if we don't continue to develop those spaces and maintain those spaces.
Yeah. Because it's not just
then
going to...
we're going to lose that
It's not
progress.
a one and done.
It's not a one and done.
We have to keep doing it.
Yeah.
We have to keep doing it. And so I think this is one of the most, this has been touted as one of the most diverse cohort of topic chairs at any convention.
Yes.
A really great range of diversity being represented for topic chairs. And then that trickles down into the types of sessions that we're seeing, the types of perspectives that we're seeing, and the types of voices that are being amplified.
Absolutely.
And so I think that was more granular. I'm gonna go big picture now. What steps can the profession take to improve representation and leadership opportunities for underrepresented groups, in your opinion?
I think taking what we have been able to do as an example. And what I mean by that is, as we know, our association has a number of volunteer opportunities. I think then if they continue to see that they're the same individuals doing the same things, it's time to take a little bit of a pause and step back and say, well, how can we bring in more people? And many times, and I've been in many rooms where the conversation has been, I never thought to ask, or I never thought about this community, or I never thought people were interested. But you just first said you never thought to ask. So how could you then think that someone wasn't interested if you never asked in the first place?
Yeah.
So it's all about looking around. There are a number of people who ask consistently, how did I get involved in this association? I put my name in the volunteer pool, and I've been sitting around for years. And this happened in the case where we've been topic chairs, or we were looking for topic chairs, and reached out to people and say, hey, have you ever considered? And the response is, I have. I've been thinking about volunteering for ASHA for a number of years.
Yeah.
You're the first person to actually have a conversation with me about this. So it's not an unwillingness to serve. It's not the unwillingness of people to put their names out there. You have to wonder where the barriers are and where they exist and how they exist.
So really being a focus on some potentially systemic barriers and bottlenecks to keep people from getting into these rooms.
And then also there's an equity issue. If you're going to volunteer for any organization, there is going to be a level of sacrifice that you have to make. So in many instances, there's probably a point of privilege that someone has to volunteer their time for free to an organization
Because
to
time
do
is money.
something.
Time is money.
And if we're looking at what we're able to do with the work that we do as practitioners, as I would say even academicians, you have to look at the different environments and see like, well, where do we have freedom of space,
I love
time,
that you brought that up.
and who is available to do certain things. So if we want spaces to look different, we have to think about how do we make the opportunities
Environment.
equitable, and not assuming that everyone who is willing and able to volunteer can do it at the
Can
same
show
level
up in
and
the
can show up
same
in the
way.
same way.
And this
Yes.
is a great time for me to go to the chat. I always like to do this. I would love for you to drop in the chat what setting you work in, because we have a really great, diverse
Group
amount
of
of people
folks.
that
Yeah.
work in. Do you work in schools? Do you work in a hospital? Do you work in acute care? Okay, we have
And-
school, elementary and preschool. And so one of the things, when I serve on the board of directors for
Right.
ASHA. I'm a board member at large in speech language pathology until December 31st. And one thing that is really interesting is you have all of these folks that come from these different backgrounds, right? And when I started, I was in an academic position, and the way academia is set up really supports
Correct.
your ability to go to conferences, do things in the middle of the day, drop everything and give a speech somewhere. But when I transitioned from my position in academia and I, went into private practice and I'm treating, I'm back in the trenches treating and doing these things, if you're a school-based SLP, yes, you might have a heart to serve, but you got 65 kids that need their minutes, right? You got your IEP you have
Absolutely.
documentation. And so like you said, we have to make sure that when we are creating opportunities, if we want to have a diverse group of folks who are contributing to our big melting pot, we have to think about now, how can we structure these opportunities to serve for people that have productivity standards,
Yes.
that have to treat 10 patients a day in their hospital, that have to do all these things, because it's not going to always look the same
Correct.
as if you have a certain position that rewards you,
Absolutely.
right? Because I know when I was
And maybe not even just reward, but it's built into what the expectations
it's
are
built
for
into your job.
Yes,
Yeah, when I was
what
in
the
academia, they
expectations
were
are.
like, your merit-based pay is determined on how many presentations you give at a national
Service
convention,
to
your
the
service.
university and
But when I worked
organizations.
in the hospital in downtown Chicago, they're like, are your notes done? Is your billing done? Have you seen all the
Yeah.
right? How many patients
Yeah.
have you seen today?
Right.
And so the reward system is completely different.
Correct.
And we have to acknowledge the spectrum of privilege
Correct.
within our own profession.
Exactly.
And so I think that I'm so glad that you brought that
Yeah.
up, because that is another intersection of our profession and an opportunity to be
Yeah.
humble,
Right.
where I can understand that if I don't have a good representation of people from different settings, it may not be because they don't want to.
Correct.
It's because we might not have the systemic structures in
Yes.
place to support them being able to help do this work.
Yes.
And why don't we have
Correct.
that?
And if we're going to be an organization that practice cultural humility, we have to practice cultural humility. And once we step into making assumptions about why someone is or isn't doing anything, we're not practicing that. It's likening it to being a school-based SLP or a school-based practitioner of any kind, and start to think about why parents don't show up to an IEP meeting. And our
what a great
assumption
analogy.
is
Yep.
that, they don't care about
They don't
their
care about their
child.
kids,
They don't
right. Yeah.
But that's a huge
That parent has
assumption.
3
There are a lot
jobs.
of things going
Yeah.
on with that. We also don't know if there's educational mistrust. We don't know what the trauma of that parent that had a school experience before, and so they don't want to step foot into a school because of what they've experienced.
Right.
Their child's concerns are maybe so overwhelming to them that they can't receive information. But they care about their child. They
Right.
care about what's going on. They care about the progress. Or their parents are like, I have put my trust into the school.
Yeah.
I can't make it there. So I've called you and I've told you that these are concerns that I have. You can have the meeting without me. But their presence or their absence doesn't give us
Because
the right
they
to
might
make
just show up
assumptions about what it
differently.
is. Absolutely.
And I'm gonna see if I can reach over, because I see people are adding. I have like 9.
Oh, we
new-
definitely want to hear what
And I wanna-
folks are saying.
And do any of you have questions for our convention co-chair as well? You could drop them in the chat as we try to scroll down the chat.
But you brought up the question about where people's
You can bring it
settings
closer.
are. Okay, that's great.
Okay.
Hey, there we are.
Someone says, keep it real, acknowledge the privilege. That's right. Amen.
But I the other thing is, while we're asking about your setting, and as you think about your setting, what are some of the barriers that you would have to donate your time to an organization? Like from your perspective out there in the audience, what are the things that make it difficult? So let's say you want to be on our convention program committee and you're a school-based practitioner, or you're a person, what would be the thing that would stop you from doing that? I would love to hear.
Oh, that's good
some
feedback.
Of those things,
Yeah, because these are the conversations
that
we have
we
to
need
be
to have,
having.
yeah.
Because our practitioners are the lifeblood of everything we do.
Absolutely.
And
they're the bridge to the evidence-based practice, from carrying the research out into the practices. So we need practitioners to do a lot of things, but we can't if they can't feel that they can be included and have value add to the conversation.
I love
For
it.
sure. I see time is one thing.
Time,
Yes,
right?
time.
And I think we don't recognize just the time of it.
And so even in that note, from a personal level, people always ask me, how do you do so much? You do so much. I honestly have curated a life, and that's a point of privilege that allows me to do that, because there's a point in time when I said, I want to give back to this profession, and I want to make that a priority.
Again,
as I develop
the
a private
privilege of
practice,
intention,
yes.
the privilege of intention, the privilege to be able to say, I want my life to look like this. So
Absolutely.
when I have a choice to do A or B, I'm going to choose A because I can.
Yeah.
That is a privilege.
And then saying yes to that means at some point I've said no to something else. But I've had to be okay with that decision.
Right.
So
And if you're a person, like I said, everybody does not necessarily have that, depending on how their family structure is. If you're the sole breadwinner in your family, right? Or if you're living under an oppressive amount of student loan debt, you might not be able to have the privilege to jump and do these things, So
there's some really great comments.
All right, so it looks like we have, I love that, having a mentor. Yeah, and we did a great episode on mentorship. I completely agree, right? In a nutshell, time that isn't beyond the 10 plus hour. Exactly, right?
See? Yeah.
We literally, and 10 plus is probably because you have 15 hours of stuff to do, but you said, I'm gonna stop at 10, right? Because normally it just never stops unless you stop it. Someone says, of course they care. Their absence many times means they cannot attend due to language.
Yes.
I love that
Thank
you brought
you
up
so
language,
much.
job, or other barriers. We need to acknowledge this and make ourselves available when they can be available. And I think that's, I think there's always this kind of push-pull dynamic with our profession, because we are a helping profession, but then we're also experiencing a level of burnout that is unprecedented. And so there's, cultural humility means, like Dieter said, is that we're going to have to be flexible.
Yes. And what does helping mean? That's probably a conversation for another day.
Supporting, that's
but
true.
What does
true.
And we all say as we're a helping profession, but what does helping mean?
Well,
and does that promote a point of privilege to say, you need my help versus we're collaborating on a situation?
I appreciate that. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Because, and when I think helping, I think like healthcare services, but you raise such a good point. That shouldn't be synonymous, because it's kind of like self-aggrandizing, right? Like,
they need
I'm a
my
helper.
help. I'm a helper.
Yeah.
I'm going to help everyone.
That's right. And then you become British, and then it just all goes to hell.
Let's keep going. Now, let's stop that. Back that up.
I just like how you just
like, how did I just walk into that?
It's a gateway drug to becoming British. First you start calling yourself a helper, and then the next thing you know, you're having tea with the queen. So you got to really be careful about that on your path to cultural humility.
Don't do that.
But I think it's a very solid point that even in the way we view ourselves as servants and as we're being helpful, we have to look at, okay, how are we, if it's become so burdensome to meet people where they're at, then why is these systems that we have in place are meant to serve us, that we create these systems in order to serve us and maximize what we do. And so if we find ourselves becoming so burned out, trying to be flexible and try to accommodate our needs, then to me that means the system is not working. That means the system is not working.
Or is the system doing exactly what it's designed to do? Because if you're too tired to think about things, you're too tired of thinking about how to break out of the system.
Yeah. And I see somebody has a comment that says, ASHA needs to make more of an effort to bring school-based therapists to the leadership table. I think
Power to the school-based SLP.
and I love it. And I on the board, I can tell you, like, I serve with several school-based
Yes.
SLPs. I think people don't realize the number of school-based SLPs who are in leadership within ASHA. And so I think that's something that I wish people knew more about.
Absolutely. Well, I will be the one to say I am a private practitioner, yes, but I have very, very publicly made sure people know that I am a school-based SLP. Even though I'm in private practice, my private practice focuses on equitable practice in schools. I started my career in schools, been in schools for most of my career, even the time when I've been in the academic environment. My practicum experiences have always tied back to school-based practices.
Love it.
So there are ways to do it, but again, there, as you continue to elevate even in your roles, there's points of privilege that come with that. So I've not stayed in full practitioner mode. There's been things I've risen into leadership or supervision or something like that. And so your time is tied a little different in those kinds of roles. That gives you some flexibility to be, involved in things where you're not tied to caseload and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So that's offered some support there. But again, I've been intentional about that because there are multiple things that I want to do.
Yeah.
So-
And you know what? One thing I want to clarify, and I want to,
Sure.
especially since this is the last episode, I don't want it to be I don't want this to be conflated with ASHA.
Oh,
I want to
for
make sure that our listeners know that even though, yes, I am finishing up a term on the board of directors for ASHA and you are the ASHA Convention co-chair, this podcast is about cultural humility in general. And it's about thinking about how we as professionals can engage and do that work for ourselves.
Absolutely.
And I will tell you just a little bit of my experience. Before I was elected to be board member at large in speech language pathology, my background is I've worked in hospitals my whole career. I've also worked for the schools. I was a travel SLP. I think I had one leadership position in a SIG group, but I had never been in leadership at ASHA at all until I was elected to this position. And if I leave us with anything in this podcast series is, I want us to be very, very careful about assuming that every problem in our profession needs to be fixed by ASHA, because that's not. I don't think that's our future, and that's just my opinion. As a person who has served at the highest level, and as a person who is actively practicing in the South Side of Chicago in my community, I think that a lot of times we as professionals, we see issues in our community, we see issues in our settings, and we immediately go to, well, like, ASHA's not doing anything about that. ASHA needs to fix it. And yes, we should demand accountability. We should demand that we need to do this work. But at the same time, I hope that through listening to these episodes and through having these types of discussions, we all feel challenged to get into the arena in a different way.
Absolutely.
Whether it be through serving, whether it be through holding associations accountable, or whether it be through marching down to that city council meeting, going to your school board meeting and saying, listen, workload, caseload, not the same. Listen, reimbursement rates, me voting for you, and I need you to make sure that you are making sure that my reimbursement rates are going to be maintained. I think that we all have a level of responsibility as professionals that is going to be so paramount in the coming future of our profession. A lot of times, speech pathologists are really good at the clinical practice part, and we're really good at the research part. But then when it comes to the advocacy part, we go, well, somebody should be doing that for us. And my question is, yes, and we also should be doing that for ourselves.
Sure.
When I step off of the board at the end of the year, my carriage is not going to turn into a pumpkin, right? My advocacy carriage is not going to turn into a pumpkin.
Because how is that useful?
Right, exactly. I have to continue to advocate. I have a couple of city council meetings that I have to be in because I'm concerned about people in my community getting access to the PACE. I'm concerned about people in my community having access to Medicaid. I'm concerned about what's going on in Chicago public schools, and there's so many children, and I don't think that they're treating speech pathologists fairly.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to have any positions come January, but those are still some things that I know that I have to challenge myself to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to kind of add to what you were saying about like what we can do as advocates. I think that it's not that we don't have the skill set to be the advocates. I don't think we think of ourselves as advocates. And until we start shifting our mentality on that, then I don't think we'll ever see that kind of local advocacy.
That's
national
true. And I'm
advocacy
wondering that,
and those
I
kinds
wonder
of
that from
things.
the audience. Do you see yourself, Miranda? And I agree with you, Miranda. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. We should be yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Spearheading the issues.
And kind of so talking about a local level, I love how you brought up going to school board meetings, council meetings, maybe board of trustees meetings at hospitals or leadership meetings if you're invited, if the public's invited. But think about even on a scale that's more even direct with your patients, clients, your students, relevant others. Let's say take a school-based SLP, for instance, and we're thinking about being consistently engaging in cultural humility. We know that there's a language difference or a language barrier, like someone mentioned, why a parent might not come to an IEP meeting. And they've maybe had an experience before where that language has not been recognized, meaning they haven't had an interpreter in the meeting, or they haven't done an assessment in both languages, or those kinds of things. As the practitioner and
Right.
the professional that knows what those best practices are,
Yeah.
you have the opportunity to advocate right there at your school to say, well, why haven't we done a bilingual assessment? Or, well, this parent really needs an interpreter, so why
Yeah.
don't we have an interpreter in the meeting that's also not the secretary in the front office? So those are the kind of conversations you can start having on a local level, being an advocate for what you know that will allow for more equitable practices to happen
Yeah.
in your school building. If you're at the hospital and there's a family that has not been getting the kind of care and support that they need, or the answers from the physician or the answers from the nurse or whatever, you know this is happening. You work on that
Yeah.
on that team, that care team. Maybe it's you that can
Yeah.
advocate. So my patient said,
Yeah.
or my patient's wife said,
And then advocating for,
yeah. And so those are
Yeah.
ways that you can do it, and you're probably doing it and not thinking about it, and
Yeah.
not thinking about that being a way to advocate for and to make sure that you're engaging in those practices that lead us to be a person that's thinking about cultural humility.
And so one thing that you just said that I thought about the person that put in that they work like 10 plus
10
hours
plus
a day.
hours, yeah.
There is no way that if you're a speech language pathologist and you're working 10 plus hours a day, that at least 40% of that is not advocacy,
Yeah.
right? Because
Correct.
that's how when we're working throughout our day,
Yeah.
it could be whether we're advocating to make sure our child's needs get met, advocating to make sure somebody's services get met. So it's already
Built into what
it's
infused,
fused in
which
what
is,
we do. Yeah.
And if we're thinking about being a person that is practicing cultural humility, that should be the same level of infusion that we have, the dedication and the time that we take to make sure our documentation's done, to make sure that we're getting to meetings on time, to make sure that we are getting the pay that we deserve. All of those things are infused into what you do. You naturally are
Yeah.
going to wake up and do that. So why can't we think about how do we infuse being a person that's practicing cultural humility in the same way? I need to think about these kinds of things all the time. And like you said, it's a constant movement. It's
Yeah.
a constant thought process. So why can't we not infuse that as part of our souls as we do with these other things?
I love it. I love it. And so let's look to the comment. I have a lot of, and somebody sent a heart. Thank you. And I'd love to hear how some of you infuse cultural humility into this work
Yeah.
that we're doing. Let's see. We need, Deidre says, we need to advocate for parents and families. As someone who lives in Mexico and has limited fluency in Spanish, I find it very difficult to advocate for myself in any situation. It makes me really humble. Wow, yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's a very good point. In terms of how it feels to come into a situation where you might not necessarily have all of the linguistic tools that you need. And just, again, we talked about being brave and just how overwhelming it is, and how we can hold space for each other.
Yeah.
And other cultures, and acknowledging how incredibly overwhelming it is to feel like you are the only person that understands how to represent your own interests as a practitioner and as a professional. A lot of times I feel like as a practicing speech pathologist, a lot of the issues that my patients face are very parallel to the issues we face as a profession,
Yeah.
And so what's weird is that sometimes it makes you want to kind of shut down because you want to keep this wall up. But I think the more that we lean into that,
Absolutely.
and because I've had some things happen, and I've been like, man, my patients went through something very similar to this, where they were the only person, in they were the only person that spoke this dialect in the hospital, and nobody understood them, and they were diagnosed with something that they shouldn't have been diagnosed with, or and then in the profession you're like, well, you're the only the practitioner that looks like you, and it was assumed that you couldn't do something. So there's so many parallels that I think we could think about. I do want to, let's see, someone else says, as a school-based SLP, it can be frustrating to try to advocate for students when the district culture, admin, school board, et cetera, is geared towards reducing the number of SPED students. This can be quite challenging in poor rural areas.
And that's where the advocacy comes in. And that's also, again, challenging the status quo. And that's what when we talked about elevating, it's the catalyst for change. It's the catalyst for doing things different, things that are going to be scary. So how can you advocate in that area to say that why will we neglect the needs of these families and these children in these areas who are already fighting for resources, when we should be able to provide the resources that they need, regardless if they're rich, poor, whatever the case might be. So it can be challenging to go into an administration office and say, we demand the respect, because what we're doing is determining the eligibility for services, which is also another discussion about power. And who holds the power to let them in or let them.
I would need a glass of wine to talk about eligibility, power, and privilege.
But the fact that these decisions are being made from these systems to say that we need to reduce the number of students for these reasons, when we're not thinking about what the students actually need and how we're here to support those needs. So we're already making these predeterminations, which goes directly in conflict with what the law was designed to do to protect people who have potential disabilities or disabilities.
When that's to me, it goes back to we look at all of these systems that we put in place. We look at our professional associations, our state associations, our national associations, districts, laws. And these systems were put in place to make our lives more efficient. But I think in SLP, it feels like these very systems they haven't evolved to keep up with us. Let's see, Miranda says, so true, the patients are struggling with the same systemic issues as we are. Yeah, it really does feel like that. Griselda says, yes, it can sometimes be as intimidating as some of my colleagues have been let go when advocating for our parents for materials. Wow.
And that's where that courage and that taking that leap and those risks come in. When you're doing work that is focused on equitable practices, to focus on equity, to focus on what's right, to have that level of respect. We always run the risk, like you said earlier, of being on that other side where there are going to be these things that are going to happen that are not going to be favorable. But what do we do then to turn around and support? That's where the community aspect is so important. And fighting against those systems sometimes do end in those consequences. So now the question is, what do we do to work to protect those people? And
absolutely.
think about those environments of safety. And what do we do to say, like, okay, so you were let go for this. Is there a position that we can bring this person and their skills in so they can continue doing the work they need to do? And then, determining what's going on in that particular system, and then kind of turn that around and figure out how do we resolve that.
And just hearing about these stories, this is not the first story of retaliation that I've heard about, but in a profession where we're so needed, where to hear the systems are kind of retaliating against professionals for doing that type of work and for actually advocating for cultural humility through the provision of giving everybody what they need. It's almost like that justice component as well. In 2024 is still kind of mind-boggling. I should not be surprised, but so I have a couple more questions, but and please, if you have any questions for Jerrold, please drop them in the chat as well. How can speech language pathologists foster more equitable collaboration with diverse populations in our clinical and professional? So if you notice, we're all over the place here all the time. So we're gonna talk about it. I like talking about things as professionals, as colleagues, right? And then also talking about it in service delivery as well, because there's so many parallels. But how do you think that speech language pathologists are able to foster more equitable collaboration with diverse populations in clinical and professional settings?
I mean, I think it goes back to what we said before, understanding what it truly means to engage in cultural humility. You can't get past, or you can't really think about what it means to be in a place where you're going to provide equity if you can't think of the other person sitting across from you as someone who might have experienced things different from you, or might be at the mercy of oppressive systems, and you see them as less than an individual. How can you want to advocate for that if you don't see them as someone who needs any of those supports, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
So you have to start to practice, like, well, there are people who are different, they come different, they come with different intersectionalities, but if you're looking at it from the lens of you know who you are and what your point of privilege is, or not even acknowledging that you have a point of privilege, you're not going to ever decenter yourself to think that someone might need additional support, because equitable practices don't mean that there's equality for all. That's not the same thing. There are going to be people who are going to need different supports, different levels of accommodation, additional resources to bring them up to maybe even where your level is as a practitioner. So if you're not willing to see that someone getting something extra is actually making it equitable, and you feeling like you're losing out on something because they've been elevated and you haven't, but that's going to be the resource that they need to be in a space where you can actually collaborate on an equitable level, then how are they ever going to be an advocate for that? And I don't think that until they recognize, understand, challenge, and face their own biases, there's not going to be a space for us to think about equitable practices as colleagues, in my opinion.
Oh, so okay, you just said three spicy things that I want to highlight. I was like, ding, ding, ding. Okay, so the one spicy thing that you said, spicy nuggets, I think that's what I'm gonna call them. The first spicy nugget was that we have to stop feeling like that in our profession, somebody has to lose in order for us to win. Woo! Can I get a hallelujah? Can I get an amen? In the profession of speech language pathology, nobody has to lose in order for us to win. There's something called duplicity. Yes, and yes, we are not happy with the way things are, and we are very excited for our future and committed to doing the work, right? Yes, we're gonna hold our national association and our state associations accountable, and we're gonna speak truth to power, and we're gonna recognize that we also could be doing more, and we also need to change some things in ourselves in order to move forward. There's not this, well, I have to knock down somebody else's sandcastle, and somebody else's dreams have to just be destroyed in order for me to get what I need as a professional. And I think that, that is unfortunately a culture of when you're coming from a place of lack, which in our profession, we're so used to not having our needs met, from not being paid fairly, from not being treated with respect, from not being given the type of opportunities that other professions who do just as much as us to being the backbone of some of these environments that we're working in. You develop this scarcity mindset. Well, I guess that in order for me to be heard and get what I need to get, somebody's going to have to lose, and that is a lie. And so I love that you said that. Another little spicy nugget that you shared. I'm gonna coin that. Nobody take that, because I'm leaving here and going straight to the trademark office. It's probably gonna be a line of people trying to do spicy nuggets, but I'm gonna get it. Another spicy nugget that you shared was the idea that if you are not doing the work on a personal level, and if you are not daily checking your own biases, that you are going to come into this type of work with a lens that's going to poison the well. And I will say this as an individual who does this work every day. I have to get up and I have to have hard conversations as a volunteer leader, right? I don't get paid. You sign up for this wild ride and you sit on the board of directors, and you come in with a set of ideas, and you're in your own echo chamber of what everyone else is saying, and you're like, yeah, we all feel this way. And then you talk to other people and they're like, no, I think that sucks. But then you have to stop and say, well, why did that irk me? And well, actually, well, you know what, you're pretty biased, because guess what? You grew up in the Midwest, you blah, 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 this. You had this opportunity. You've been able to do this. Oh, well, you know what? You need to check that, treasure. You know what I mean? And sometimes you have to really check yourself.
You really
and
do.
I think being able to be vulnerable,
Yes.
being vulnerable is a superpower.
Yeah.
I have so many biases that every single day I have to check. It's a mess.
It is a mess.
It's very scary. And so we should all be really committed to doing that self-work first. They talk about, and Brene Brown talks about this, and I'm a big Brene Brown fan. She talks about how you have to get into the arena.
Yeah.
And getting into the arena usually starts with taking a look in the mirror and being like, man, what are some things that I need to grow on?
Yeah.
What are some, every time I have a conversation with a speech pathologist who doesn't look like me, who practices in a different setting, I realize a bias that I've been carrying that I need to get rid of, that I need to unravel, that I need to unpack. That's why I love the Harvard bias test, the Harvard Association bias test. I've put it in our chat before. And I Google it. I think it's called the Harvard Implicit Bias. It's called the Harvard Implicit Bias Association.
Yeah.
And then the third spicy nugget, you forgot. I'm not letting it go.
Like,
when I get my hooks and you're like, we're not done with this. No, we're committed to the bit now.
It's a 3-piece.
It's a 3-piece spicy nugget. The third spicy nugget that you shared was talking about how this is not a linear thing. You talked about how do we get here, then we get pushed back, this is not a linear trajectory, right, to enlightenment. And I loved how
what if you never get enlightened? You still have to
might
do
not,
the work,
right?
So
You still got it, right?
So we want this. We want elevation to look like this. But if you look at any mountain range, you look at any hills with valleys, whatever, you don't see a straight. It's jagged. It is moved. It's as you're climbing. There's going to be shifting. There's just so many things that are happening as you're going up. The same way as if you're rising through any other air travel. There's turbulence. We have to take a detour.
You go up, and then they're like, wait, seatbelt light back on.
We gotta burn off some of this fuel, so let's go back. There's a lot of things that happen as we're rising, and so it's not going to be just straight up. It's not going to be comfortable. And you made me think about something else too. One of our mentors, Dr. Yvette Heider, we were having a conversation, and one of the things that she said, and I have constantly said this over and over, is that change is a long game. So whether that's you're trying to change a system, whether you're trying to change a process, or you're changing yourself.
Yeah.
It's a long game. So like you're saying, you wake up every day and you think about like, okay, well, I have to think about what I just said yesterday. I had the same thing that happened. We were at a restaurant, and I was like, oh my gosh, I think I just assumed someone's identity.
Yep.
By a statement that I said that just rolls off our tongue, it's like sir, ma'am, those kinds of things. And we don't know that unless we've asked. Man, I made a great assumption. I was like, I need to check myself on that. And I said that out loud. It was like, oh, I didn't like how that just happened.
Yeah,
so.
and you're like, on my way to do that equity and inclusion podcast,
Right.
I'm over here checking myself. I have to, and that's, it's not pretty. It's not, but I think,
but we acknowledge it and we change it, and it's not anything that you have to be ashamed of. It's a process.
And shame, I think that's like my new most thing that I'm interested in reading about.
Cersei.
I love it. Those Game of Thrones lovers out there. I hope you appreciated that reference. But you know what? There's this new thing I've been reading about called shame and competence. Have you heard of it?
No, I have not.
Or shame competence versus shame and competence. So healthcare providers are now starting to be trained in shame competence, meaning they have to become competent in recognizing the role that shame plays in the patient experience and how shame can actually result in adverse healthcare outcomes. How if a patient is carrying shame about themselves or their families or who they're supposed to be, or who they're not supposed to be, how that can kind of really mess up the patient's ability to access care. And when we talk about our profession and the role that shame plays and us being culturally humble and the role that shame plays in us advocating the role that Shane plays in us receiving what we feel like the support that we need to get. That's pretty wild. So we have about one more minute. I know we started a little bit late, but I want to open the floor. Does anyone have questions before we sign off? I can tell you, as we're letting people formulate their thoughts, I just love sitting around kicking the breeze with you and talking about all the big things. And I want to thank the audience for just sharing all of your thoughts.
Yes. It's impactful to have these conversations and to think about building community in these ways, because many times we feel like we're thinking along.
Yeah.
We're in our thoughts by ourselves, and there's not other people who are relating to this, and there are many more people.
And if I was to challenge everyone, I would say get in community with two people who think completely opposite than you. And so that's the charge. As we're wrapping up 2024 and finishing up our last episode of this podcast, get in community and get in conversation with two people that think completely opposite than you as it relates to cultural humility, these big things, and start having conversations with people outside of your echo chamber, because that's really where the cool work gets done. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Dr. Treasure Williams-Wood. This is Culturally Speaking. Thank you to my guest, Jerrold Jackson, SLP Convention co-chair. If I see you around in Seattle, please say hi to me. Yes. And have a wonderful rest of the day. Yeah, exactly. We're real people. Take care of yourselves and each other.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for today's course. To complete the course, you must log into your account and complete the quiz and the survey. If you have indicated that you are part of the ASHA registry and entered both your ASHA number and a complete mailing address in your account profile prior to course completion, we will submit earned CEUs to ASHA. Please allow 1 to 2 months from the completion date for your CEUs to reflect on your ASHA transcript. Please note that if this information is missing, we cannot submit to ASHA on your behalf. Thanks again for joining us. We hope to see you next time. Each episode comes with an accompanying audio course on speechtherapypd.com, available for a 0.1 ASHA CEU. And just for our listeners, get $20 off any subscription with promo code SLPLearn20. Speechtherapypd.com is run by SLPs for SLPs. They've got the largest library of ASHA CE eligible courses out there, and they're adding fresh content every week. Remember, use the code SLPLearn20 to get $20 off access to over 1,000 courses for an entire year. Head over to speechtherapypd.com for more information and start earning CEs today. Thanks for tuning in to the SLP Learning Series. And don't forget, speechtherapypd.com is your go-to for all things ASHA CEUs. Your positive reviews and support mean the world to us, and we'd love for you to drop us a quick review and hit that subscribe button.